This is the first of a series of 3 videos about the wrecks of the British battleship Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser Repulse. Both capital ships were sunk in one action in the South China Sea on 10th December 1941, almost 200 miles north of Singapore. I was lucky to take part in a number of expeditions to dive these ships in the early 2000s before, sadly, these 2 wrecks, along with a number of other British, Dutch and American World War II war graves, became the subject of intensive illegal salvage work. Both these wrecks have now been greatly damaged, while some of the other wrecks have been completely dismantled and removed, all for the precious pre-Hiroshima steel and non-ferrous metals. It is a shocking tragedy, so my aim with these 3 videos is to record what the wrecks were like before this awful salvage work started. Rather than one unwieldy long video covering the battle and the 2 wrecks, this first video will cover the deployment of Prince of Wales and Repulse to Singapore, as aforesaid, and the fateful battle that saw both capital ships go to the bottom of the South China Sea. A separate video will then follow at each individual wreck. By October 1941, Britain had been fighting alone for 2 years. It was still 2 months before the Japanese surprise raid in Pearl Harbor, and the USA and Japan were not yet at war. But Japan had stationed thousands of troops, scores of warships and hundreds of planes in southern Indochina around Saigon that clearly threatened British Malaya and were just 700 miles away from the important British bastion of Singapore. That's less than the length of mainland Britain. War in the Pacific with Japan was looking increasingly likely. To deter the threatened Japanese invasion of Malaya and Thailand, Churchill determined to send a small but powerful naval squadron to Singapore that could catch and kill any enemy ship. The brand new battleship Prince of Wales was eventually selected as flagship for this small squadron, which would be commanded by Admiral Sir Tom Phillips and was designated Force G. The Prince of Wales was the latest in battleship construction. Heavily armoured, she bristled with 10 main battery 14-inch guns arranged in 2 quad turrets, A and Y, and a twin super-firing B turret set just behind quad A turret in front of the bridge. Prince of Wales was fitted with a secondary armament of 16 of the latest, much vaunted 5.25-inch dual-purpose guns set in 8 twin turrets, 4 on either beam. These guns were effective against aircraft up to 49,000 feet, and also could strike surface targets up to 14 miles away. In addition, she carried powerful Bofors 40mm guns, Oerlikon 20mm guns, as well as pom-pom 2-pounders and machine guns. Prince of Wales would be joined by the battlecruiser Repulse, which was operating in the Indian Ocean. Originally entering service in 1916, Repulse had been reconstructed in the 1930s and carried a main battery of 6 15-inch guns set in 3 twin turrets, along with an anti-aircraft battery. Prince of Wales and Repulse would have an escort of 4 destroyers, and the aircraft carrier HMS Indomitable would provide fleet air cover. Ominously, Indomitable ran aground in Jamaica in November and had to head to a US Navy yard for repair. She would not reach Singapore in time. Force G arrived at Singapore on 2nd December 1941 and, in a show of force to reassure the population, sailed around Singapore Island and then up the Johor Strait before entering the naval dockyard to a rapturous welcome and being redesignated Force Z. But as the powerful squadron arrived at Singapore, no one knew that Japan had already made the decision to go to war with the USA, Britain and Holland, and that Japan's 6-carrier strike force was already halfway across the North Pacific en route to attack Pearl Harbor less than a week later, on 7th December 1941. At dawn on 4th December 1941, just 2 days after Force G's arrival in Singapore, the first Japanese troop transports carrying an invasion force of more than 26,000 men left ports in China on a 4-day insertion passage bound for landing beaches in southern Thailand and northeast Malaya. The invasion convoys were cloaked by poor monsoon weather that stopped British reconnaissance planes flying. On the second day of the invasion deployment, 5th December 1941, the poor monsoon weather continued. The British could only send out limited flights, which did not detect the invasion transport ships. But on day 3 of the passage, around midday on 6th December, a Royal Australian Air Force reconnaissance flight spotted the Japanese troop transports in the Gulf of Siam, today known as the Gulf of Thailand. The next day, 7th December, heavy weather closed in again, with rain squalls, fog and dense cloud reducing visibility for Allied reconnaissance aircraft. Cloaked by this monsoon weather, just after 9 a.m, the Japanese invasion convoy split into several smaller sections bound for multiple landing beaches in southern peninsular Thailand and northern Malaya, such as Senggora, Patani and Kota Bharu. The Japanese landings began early in darkness on Monday 8th December, almost simultaneously with the strike on Pearl Harbor. The RAF airfields throughout northern Malaya were bombed, and by the end of the day, the RAF in northern Malaya had been largely decimated. Faced with reports of multiple beach landings to the north, with Singapore now being bombed and the RAF devastated in the north, Admiral Phillips determined that he would sortie Force Z in darkness that evening of 8th December 1941, heading north towards Senggora in southern Thailand. He hoped his powerful force would be hidden from spotter planes and submarines by the monsoon rains and low cloud throughout the next day, 9th December. If his plan worked and his force remained undetected, Force Z would arrive at first light on 10th December off the Japanese invasion beaches at Senggora, and, with the element of surprise, his powerful ships would smash the Japanese troop transports and devastate Japanese forces ashore with a naval bombardment. To preserve secrecy and retain the element of surprise, Force Z would maintain strict radio silence. In the absence of Force Z's own aircraft carrier, a number of Brewster Buffalo fighters stationed at Singapore were earmarked for fleet defence on request by the Navy, but any such request would require fleet radio silence to be broken. Force Z departed Singapore at dusk on the evening of 8th December 1941, taking a circuitous route up the Malayan east coast that was well away from the coast to avoid being spotted. Force Z formed up into night cruising formation, with the destroyer Vampire in the lead, followed by the destroyer Tenedos, then Prince of Wales, followed by the Repulse, which took up position 800 yards astern of the flagship. The destroyers Electra and Express steamed well ahead of the other ships, streaming minesweeping gear. As Force Z steamed north in darkness at 17.5 knots, a signal was received advising that fighter protection off Senggora on 10th December would not now be possible. The coming of dawn on 9th December revealed rain and low cloud, with visibility reduced to half a mile. These were perfect conditions to hide Force Z from Japanese air patrols. However, unknown to the British, at 1:45 p.m, a Japanese submarine spotted Force Z. The submarine shadowed Force Z for 3 hours, reporting its presence as the squadron ran north towards the invasion beaches. Later that afternoon at about 4:45 p.m, with just over 1 hour to go until sunset at 6 p.m, when darkness would again hide Force Z, the skies cleared. 3 Japanese reconnaissance planes were quickly spotted, and these planes shadowed Force Z until sunset. Once darkness had arrived, Admiral Phillips ordered Force Z to steer northwest towards the invasion beaches and increase speed to 26 knots. By now, Force Z was almost 300 miles north of Singapore. But as Force Z surged through the night towards Senggora, a signal was received that a Japanese battleship, a heavy cruiser, 11 destroyers and a number of troop transports had been sighted close to the coast near Kota Bharu, further to the south, earlier in the day. Kota Bharu was in fact 130 miles south of Senggora towards Singapore. With Force Z now clearly spotted, having lost the element of surprise, Admiral Phillips was forced to abandon the raid on Senggora, and at 9:45 p.m, in darkness, he turned Force Z around to head southwest towards Kota Bharu. The reported Japanese ships were exactly the sort of force that Force Z was designed to decimate. Just before midnight, Force Z received another signal. Immediate, enemy reported landing Kuantan. Kuantan was halfway down the Malayan Peninsula and well south of Force Z's current position. A Japanese landing there could cut off British troops in northern Malaya. Admiral Phillips ordered another change of course, hoping to appear off Kuantan just before dawn and surprise Japanese shipping and landing forces. Speed was increased to 25 knots. The hunt was still on. And yet, still maintaining strict radio silence, no signal was sent to Singapore to advise of the change of course from Kota Bharu to Kuantan. If it had, then the Brewster Buffalo fighters, kept out of the fighting at Singapore and earmarked for fleet defence, could have been sent to provide air cover. The Buffaloes, however, remained parked on the ground at Singapore. As first light crept over the horizon at 5 a.m. on 10th December 1941, Force Z was about 70 nautical miles off Kuantan. All ships went to full action stations, and as dawn arrived, lookouts saw no enemy planes or surface vessels. But an hour and a half later, at 6:30 a.m, a Japanese reconnaissance aircraft appeared and began to shadow Force Z. Still maintaining radio silence, the Brewster Buffalo fighters at Singapore were not requested. By 8 a.m, Force Z had arrived off Kuantan. The destroyer Express was detached to reconnoitre close inshore and reported back, all as quiet as a wet Sunday afternoon. But then, instead of heading south for the safety of Singapore, Admiral Phillips turned Force Z northeast to investigate a distant tug that was towing 3 barges. These turned out to be innocuous civilian vessels, but the diversion north had taken 1.5 precious hours. Meanwhile, in Saigon that day, at first light at 5 a.m, 9 Japanese Mitsubishi G3M long-range reconnaissance planes, Allied reporting codename Nell, took off and headed southwest towards the reported location for Force Z. Then, an hour and a half later, at 6:25 a.m, 85 twin-engine G3M Nell and Mitsubishi G4M Betty long-range bombers began to take off. 34 of these bombers carried bombs, 51 carried torpedoes. The 85 Nell and Betty bombers flew slowly south in 10 squadrons, waiting for the 9 reconnaissance Nell bombers far ahead to spot Force Z. At 10:15, one Nell reconnaissance plane found Force Z, sending back details of its location, heading and strength, and providing a directional signal. The 85 Japanese bombers now headed directly for Force Z. Within an hour, at 11 a.m, a first squadron of 8 Japanese Nell bombers came in view of the Force Z warships below. Each of these Nells was carrying a single 550-pound bomb. In line abreast, the 8 bombers flew over Repulse at 10,000 feet. Far below, all Force Z ships went to action stations to repel aircraft, and in Prince of Wales, gunnery officers and the much vaunted 5.25-inch high-angle guns began to plot the range, height and speed of the enemy planes. Signal flags were next hoisted on Prince of Wales, ordering ships to turn together 30 degrees to starboard, and as the manoeuvre began, 4 of the 5.25-inch high-angle mounts on the starboard side of Prince of Wales were able to train on the enemy. The order "commence, commence, commence" was given, and anti-aircraft fire was opened at about 12,000 yards. But it was immediately noticed that the AA shells were exploding to the right of the Japanese bombers, which were not taking any evasive action at all. The swing of the ship to starboard was counteracting the corrections to the left being given to the guns, and then, as the starboard turn became more pronounced, the guns on the starboard beam had to cease firing as the huge superstructure of Prince of Wales masked the line of fire. The turn continued, and just as the Japanese aircraft came in sight of the port guns, those guns were able to open fire. But just as the port guns began firing, Admiral Phillips signalled all ships to turn 50 degrees to port. The new port turn now caused the port guns to cease firing as the superstructure again masked the enemy planes. For a few moments no anti-aircraft guns at all fired, before the turn to port allowed the starboard guns to begin firing again. These cumbersome fleet manoeuvres by signal flag had robbed the gunnery officers of the opportunity to settle down to a long run of firing that would have enabled corrections to be made and more effective fire to be brought against the unswerving, compact formation of Japanese planes. Perhaps realising that fleet manoeuvres by signal flag were ineffectual, Admiral Phillips signalled that the ship commanders now had freedom of movement, but still radio silence was maintained and no call for the Brewster Buffalo fighters at Singapore, just an hour's flying time away, was made. At about 11:30 a.m, the 8 Nell high-altitude bombers released their bombs simultaneously. Most were near misses that straddled Repulse, but one hit Repulse amidships, penetrating the upper deck to burst on the splinter deck below. Although there were a number of casualties, her speed was unaffected. She steamed on, trailing a small curl of smoke. In this famous archive photograph taken from a Japanese plane, Repulse at bottom left is straddled by near misses, whilst Prince of Wales at top right manoeuvres at speed, her wake revealing the turn to port before a subsequent pronounced turn to starboard. With the first bombing wave now over, Force Z resumed steaming south towards Singapore. But within minutes, radar in Prince of Wales picked up an even larger force of planes approaching. With radio silence still maintained, no one in Singapore knew of Force Z's diversion to Kuantan, or indeed where Force Z actually now was. At 11:38 am, 17 high-level bombers and 50 torpedo bombers began their attack from about 8 miles away, splitting up to make simultaneous bombing and torpedo attacks on both Prince of Wales and Repulse, and thus split British anti-aircraft fire. The Nell and Betty torpedo bombers flew across the bows of the southbound British ships whilst out of range, before forming up in line astern as they increased speed and began to drop towards Force Z. The first line of 9 torpedo bombers, each carrying a torpedo with a 330-pound warhead, split up in 3 neat turns, 3 aircraft to each turn, to now face towards the Prince of Wales port beam in a huge extended arc that was flying directly towards a great battleship at about 180 miles per hour, some 100 to 150 feet above the water. All 8 portside 5.25-inch high-angle guns in the 4 twin turrets now opened fire, to be joined by the Bofors 40mm on the quarterdeck. Then the 4 8-barrel Chicago piano pom-poms began pumping out their 2-pound shells. Finally, the shorter-range 20mm Oerlikon and machine guns opened fire. Tracers arced up towards the black dots in a sky that was peppered with bursts of flak. After 12 salvos, the 5.25-inch guns switched from controlled fire at individual planes to barrage fire, throwing up a curtain of flak, but the gunners were not prepared for the fast speed of 180 miles per hour that the Japanese planes approached at. They are trained to repel attacks at 100 miles an hour, the speed that the Royal Navy's own Fairey Swordfish biplane attacked at. Most British shells burst behind the Japanese aircraft as they roared towards the British ships. The torpedo bombers dropped their torpedoes once they were between 1,500 to just 600 metres from the huge port beam of the Prince of Wales. Captain Leach ordered hard a port in an attempt to comb the tracks of the torpedoes, which were set to run at a depth of 6 metres at 25 knots. But before the turn was completed, 2 torpedoes hit Prince of Wales. One torpedo was a hit on the port beam aft, which caused little damage to the side armour belt and torpedo protection system. The second torpedo, however, struck a battleship's Achilles heel, the unarmoured area at the stern, out with the armoured box of the citadel, where the rudders, propellers and prop shafts had to be free to operate. This was the critical strike that doomed the Prince of Wales. Prince of Wales had 4 propellers, and their torpedo hit just forward of the bracket that supported the free section of outboard prop shaft, the top propeller in this model. The torpedo strike blasted a hole in the hull that was 6 metres by 4 metres wide and was very close to where the prop shaft entered the hull tube. Inside the ship here, the shaft alley was large enough for a man to stand upright in, and the shaft alley ran forward inside the ship for about 200 feet to B engine room. The outboard port propeller was rotating at 204 revolutions per minute, but now damaged, it was turning out of centre and began to vibrate violently, weakening the struts of the hull support bracket that held the free section of shaft and propeller in place. Fierce vibrations ran along the shaft for 250 feet all the way to B engine room, damaging watertight glands around the shaft and transfer bulkheads, and allowing a direct route for water to flood up the prop shaft alley. The violent vibration now snapped the 17.5-inch thick steel propeller shaft itself, and the suddenly free length of prop shaft, along with the hull bracket and the huge propeller, broke free and fell towards the seabed, ripping the stern tube out of the hull itself. Huge volumes of water now poured into the shaft alley and searched its way to the very heart of the battleship, to B engine room, which now had to be quickly abandoned. The battleship's speed began to drop from 25 knots, as she developed a list to port of 11.5 degrees. Her starboard beam now began to rise up out of the water. She had soon settled by the stern by 1.5 metres. Worse still, as the outboard port propeller, hull bracket and prop shaft fell away to the seabed, debris entered the port inboard propeller race, second from the top in this model, damaging its blades in operation and forcing its turbine to be shut down. Both port propellers were now out of action, and the battleship slowed further to 15 knots. After seeing Prince of Wales begin to list, At 11:58 a.m, just before midday, Captain Tennant aboard Repulse broke radio silence and radioed Singapore for help. If the Fleet Defence Brewster Buffalo fighters had been requested earlier when Force Z was first spotted, despite their poor performance as fighter aircraft, they would still have made short work of the Japanese bombers, which had no fighter protection at this long range. But now that radio silence had finally been broken and the perilous state of Force Z had been revealed, 11 Brewster Buffalo fighters took off from Singapore immediately, but it was already too late. 15 Japanese bombers now attacked the Repulse, and Captain Tennant threw the huge Repulse about like a destroyer as he successfully combed the tracks of all of the torpedoes and avoided all the high-level bombs dropped from 12,000 feet. This phase of the Japanese attack now ended at 12 noon and a lull descended. The flooding aft inside Prince of Wales had plunged corridors into darkness and caused failure of the electrical system that powered the 5.25-inch gun turrets. Water also damaged internal communications and systems for training and elevating the 5.25-inch guns and the pom-poms, such that none could now be trained properly. Without power, both steering motors were dead. The steering gear had jammed, and the single large rudder was now not able to function. The remaining 2 starboard propellers were still operational, but with the rudder now jammed, they caused the battleship to veer to port in a long, slow turn. Repulse, meantime, was 3 miles away, relatively undamaged and still in fine fighting form. The lull ended at 12:19 when another swarm of Japanese aircraft attacked, by when, with the list to port and the starboard side now risen higher out of the water, those anti-aircraft guns on the starboard beam of Prince of Wales that could still fire could not now depress sufficiently to hit the 6 torpedo bombers that attacked the starboard beam. 3 torpedoes struck Prince of Wales in quick succession. One hit forward of the citadel at the very bow, blowing a 7-metre diameter hole completely through the unarmoured bow. The second torpedo hit just above the forward edge of the bilge keel, detonating on the very bottom plate of the thick armour belt. The bottom edge of the plate was pushed inwards, and the blast was deflected downwards to blow in the outer skin of the side torpedo defence system and create another 7-metre wide hole. With the voids of the starboard torpedo defence system being counter-flooded to reduce the port list and now filled with incompressible water, these voids likely did not dissipate the blast as intended. No one knows how far inboard the blast penetrated, but had the ship not been listening to port, this torpedo would have hit square on higher up the vertical side armour belt, which would have handled the impact. The third torpedo struck the hull just abaft Y turret, jamming the outboard starboard propeller shaft, the lower propeller in this model, and knocking it out of action. Only the inboard starboard shaft was now operational, and the ship's speed dropped to 8 knots. As Prince of Wales took on more water through uncontrollable progressive flooding into the 4 large holes in her hull, she continued to settle steadily by the stern. With the Prince of Wales clearly mortally wounded, 20 torpedo bombers now attacked Repulse from all sides in a starfish attack. Such was the number of torpedoes in the water simultaneously that it was impossible for the Repulse to comb all the tracks. In the course of 4 to 5 minutes, Repulse was hit by 4, possibly 5 torpedoes and quickly started to list to port. The attacks ended at 12:30, by when Repulse was settling steadily into the water. The order to abandon ship was given, and the crew started jumping over the side into a spreading pool of oil and sliding down the starboard side of the ship, which was now rising up out of the water. The cries of men trapped below were heard coming up ventilation shafts. Repulse rolled completely over until her mast seemed to rest on the surface. She then capsized fully and went under, her stern rising up as she went. By 12:32, within just 11 minutes of the attack, she was gone to the bottom of the South China Sea. At 12:41, 8 Nell high-altitude bombers carrying 500-kilogram bombs now attacked Prince of Wales. One bomb damaged X boiler room, which powered the one remaining prop shaft. All propellers were now out of action, and the great battleship wallowed to a stop, continuing to settle slowly deeper by the stern and roll to port. Survivors recalled that it looked as though the tide was coming in as water crept up her decks. An uncanny silence now descended, and at 1 p.m. the order to abandon ship was given. In this iconic photo, as gunners remain at their posts in their anti-flash gear, hundreds of men are attempting to cross over to the destroyer Express, which had come alongside. Makeshift lines and gangplanks were put across the gap between the two ships, but as Prince of Wales rolled further to port, the gap widened and the gangplanks fell into the sea. Men continued to swing across the gap on ropes, but the situation was becoming desperate now, and some men were falling to their deaths. At 1:15 p.m, some 90 minutes after the first torpedo attack, the starboard beam of Prince of Wales rose up under the destroyer Express, forcing her to pull away as the hulls ground together. Hundreds of men were left on Prince of Wales. They now congregated at the highest points, the forecastle and the starboard gunwale, and as she went right over onto her port beam ends, they walked down the exposed starboard side and jumped into the water. Within another 10 minutes, like Repulse, Prince of Wales too had gone to the bottom of the South China Sea. The first Brewster Buffalo fighters from Singapore arrived at 1:20, just 3 minutes before Prince of Wales turned turtle and sank. The battle was over. Some 840 British sailors had perished.